When we speak of attracting toxic people, we are not dealing with accidents of fate or random cruelty. We are facing the mysterious operation of the psyche itself, which seeks to reveal to consciousness what has long been buried. Carl Jung understood that every human being carries within them a shadow, the sum of all that we reject, deny, and refuse to see in ourselves. This shadow does not vanish because we ignore it. Instead, it operates beneath awareness, coloring our perceptions, choices, and relationships. When it remains unseen, it is projected outward, appearing as qualities we despise or fear in others. Thus, the toxic person often functions as the mirror of our unacknowledged self, showing us through pain what we have failed to integrate within. The human ego strives for goodness, light, and control, but the psyche is more inclusive. It seeks wholeness, not perfection. To become whole, one must recognize not only one's admirable traits, but also one's darker tendencies: envy, selfishness, resentment, control, neediness, and deceit. Because these aspects are incompatible with our self-image, we cast them into the unconscious. Yet, energy cannot be destroyed. It only changes form. What we repress internally returns to us externally, clothed in the form of other people who embody those very traits. The manipulative partner, the narcissistic friend, or the domineering superior. All these figures may represent the shadow's attempt to gain our attention. When someone triggers us intensely, it is rarely about them alone. The emotional charge reveals an inner complex that resonates with what they represent. The psyche externalizes what it cannot yet internalize. The other becomes the stage upon which our hidden conflicts are played out. In this sense, relationships are psychological mirrors. They expose us to ourselves, often in uncomfortable ways. We meet in others what our consciousness refuses to acknowledge, for the psyche insists on balance. If we identify too strongly with goodness, life will show us our capacity for cruelty through those who harm us. If we pride ourselves on strength, we will meet weakness that evokes disgust or pity. The goal is not to condemn these reflections, but to recognize them as part of our total nature. It is easy to judge the toxic person, to declare them the problem and ourselves the victim. But such an attitude keeps us bound to the projection. Jung taught that what we resist persists. The more we despise a certain quality in others, the more it dominates our perception and experience. Only by turning inward, by daring to ask what inner reality corresponds to this outer figure, can we withdraw the projection and reclaim our power. This is the beginning of psychological freedom. The person who provokes you is not your enemy, but your instructor. They reveal what you must integrate to grow beyond repetition. Consider, for example, someone who repeatedly attracts controlling partners. On the surface, it appears they are simply unlucky in love. Yet beneath this pattern lies a deeper psychological truth. The control they resent in others mirrors the control they secretly exert upon themselves. Perhaps they suppress their own desires to please others, living under an internal tyrant far harsher than any external one. The outer relationship dramatizes this inner dynamic. When such insight dawns, the pattern dissolves. One no longer needs a mirror once one has seen what it reflects. This confrontation with the shadow is not pleasant. It requires humility, honesty, and courage. To admit that the qualities we condemn in others live also within us feels like a humiliation of the ego. Yet, paradoxically, it is through this humiliation that true strength is born. The integrated person does not idealize themselves nor demonize others. They recognize that human nature contains both light and darkness, love and hatred, creation and destruction. The goal is not to eradicate the shadow, but to be in conscious relationship with it. What was once projected outward becomes internalized as knowledge and compassion. The toxic person thus plays an essential role in the alchemy of the soul. They force us to confront our limitations, awaken dormant emotions, and dismantle illusions about who we are. Through the pain they cause, they initiate us into self-awareness. If we can respond with introspection rather than blame, we begin the process Jung called individuation, the movement toward wholeness. Each confrontation with toxicity becomes an opportunity to retrieve a piece of the psyche we had lost. The mirror may show us the ugliness we would rather deny, but only by looking into it can we discover our own hidden beauty. In understanding that the shadow is our own reflection, we cease to be victims of toxic encounters and become participants in the great work of becoming whole. Projection is one of the most subtle yet powerful mechanisms of the human psyche. It is the process by which we attribute to others the qualities, feelings, and motives that we cannot or will not acknowledge within ourselves. Jung saw projection not as a mere psychological mistake, but as a fundamental way the unconscious communicates with consciousness. The psyche, in its wisdom, externalizes what the ego is unprepared to see directly. In this way, life becomes the canvas upon which our inner contents are painted, and relationships become the mirrors that reflect the unseen depths of our own souls. When we encounter someone who provokes strong emotions, whether fascination or repulsion, we are meeting a projection. The intensity of the feeling is the clue. We believe we are responding to the other person's traits, yet in truth, we are confronting our own. For instance, the arrogance we despise in another may reflect our own repressed pride. The admiration we feel for someone's confidence may be our unacknowledged desire for self-expression. The psyche seeks balance, and what we disown, it will show us in others until recognition occurs. Thus, projection is not an error to be corrected, but a message to be deciphered. The problem arises when we remain unconscious of this process. Instead of seeing projections as mirrors, we take them for reality. We become entangled in judgments, attachments, and conflicts, mistaking outer events for inner truths. This confusion fuels endless cycles of disappointment and pain. When one continually attracts toxic people, it is often the psyche's way of dramatizing an internal imbalance. The manipulator, the deceiver, or the emotional vampire in our lives might be the embodiment of qualities we have refused to own. Perhaps our own latent capacity for manipulation, dishonesty, or dependency. The psyche brings these traits before us in the form of others so that we may finally recognize and integrate them. Projection serves both defensive and developmental purposes. Defensively, it allows the ego to maintain its self-image by displacing unacceptable qualities outward. It protects the conscious mind from being overwhelmed by the shadow. Yet developmentally, it also becomes the means through which the unconscious seeks to expand awareness. By projecting, we are forced into relationship with our hidden parts. The outer encounter becomes the stage for inner transformation. When the same type of person or situation keeps reappearing, it signals that a particular lesson has not yet been learned. The projection insists on recognition because wholeness demands it. Jung often warned that withdrawing projections is one of the most difficult tasks of psychological work. It requires a willingness to turn inward, to question one's certainties, and to see that the problem may not lie solely in the external world. When we realize that our perceptions are colored by inner content, we begin to relate to others more consciously. We see not only who they are, but also what they evoke within us. This awareness marks the beginning of true relationship, not between two egos defending their images, but between two souls meeting through the play of projection and reflection. To withdraw a projection is not to deny the reality of the other person's flaws or virtues. It is to see that our reaction to them tells us as much about ourselves as about them. If someone's selfishness enrages us, the rage may point to our own repressed desire to prioritize ourselves. If someone's neediness exhausts us, it may expose the part of us that fears dependence or vulnerability. Each emotional charge is a message from the unconscious. By deciphering these messages, we reclaim the energy that was invested in the projection and return it to the self. In relationships, projections often form the invisible threads that bind people together. What we fall in love with or despise in another is often an image of our own soul. The toxic partner may carry the projection of our unhealed wounds, replaying patterns that trace back to childhood or earlier experiences of rejection. To break such cycles, one must bring light to the darkness within. Awareness dissolves projection. When we take back what we have placed outside ourselves, we become less reactive, more whole, and more capable of genuine connection. Projection, then, is the language of the unconscious, speaking to us through the people we attract and the emotions they awaken. Life becomes the mirror of our inner state, and every encounter, pleasant or painful, carries meaning. To live consciously is to listen to this language, to translate the outer dramas into inner insight. Only then do we stop blaming others for our suffering and begin to see that each relationship, however difficult, is part of the psyche's grand design, to make us aware of who we truly are beneath the illusions of separation. In this realization, projection ceases to be a curse and becomes a sacred dialogue between the ego and the soul. When life seems to repeat the same painful patterns, it is not chance or punishment, but a deep psychological necessity. Jung observed that the unconscious has its own intelligence, and that it will continue to arrange outer circumstances in ways that compel us to face what we have refused to see. Repetition in this sense is not failure, it is the psyche's persistent demand for awareness. The same kind of toxic relationships, the betrayals and disappointments, appear again and again, each one a symbolic enactment of an inner story still unresolved. Until the lesson is learned, the pattern continues, for the psyche is not content with avoidance, it insists on wholeness. The repetition of toxic encounters often begins in early life, where our first experiences of love and trust were shaped. The child who felt unseen may unconsciously seek validation through those who withhold affection. The one who learned to earn love through sacrifice may attract those who exploit generosity. The unconscious creates the conditions of the original wound, not to torment us, but to offer another chance for consciousness. The psyche repeats what it cannot yet integrate. It replays the old drama with new actors, hoping the self will awaken to its own participation in the script. This compulsion to repeat is one of the most difficult truths to accept. The ego, which lives in linear time, believes that each event is separate, each relationship new. But the psyche moves in cycles, not lines. It returns to the same themes again and again, deepening them until insight dawns. Every new toxic relationship is a reflection of the same unresolved inner dynamic. Perhaps a hidden belief that one is unworthy of respect, or a fear of independence masked by dependency. The people we attract play roles in our psychological theater, each performance more urgent than the last, pressing us towards self-recognition. Jung compared this process to a dream that repeats because the dreamer refuses to understand its message. If you ignore the dream, it becomes more vivid, even nightmarish, until it captures your full attention. So too with the psyche, when we do not listen to the subtle signals, discomfort, anxiety, restlessness, the unconscious amplifies its message through outer events. The repeated appearance of toxic relationships is the psyche's way of shouting, "Look here. This is the wound that needs your attention." What appears as bad luck is, in fact, a summons to consciousness. When we finally pause and ask, "What is this pattern trying to teach me?" a shift occurs. Instead of seeing ourselves as victims of circumstance, we begin to perceive a deeper meaning in our experiences. The toxic person becomes less an enemy and more a messenger. They embody the disowned aspects of our psyche that seek reintegration. The manipulator may mirror our own suppressed desire for control. The critic may reflect our harsh inner voice, and the betrayer may personify our inability to trust ourselves. Each repetition offers another opportunity to reclaim what was lost to denial or repression. Breaking the cycle requires honesty and inner work. Awareness alone is not enough. We must feel what was once too painful to feel. The psyche repeats trauma until the emotions connected to it can be experienced consciously. The goal is not to blame ourselves for attracting toxicity, but to understand that our unconscious choices are attempts at healing. We return to the wound because the wound is where our wholeness awaits. Each encounter that triggers us opens a doorway into deeper understanding, if we have the courage to walk through it. When consciousness expands, the pattern loosens. The next time a familiar toxic dynamic presents itself, we recognize it sooner. We sense the warning signs, the subtle emotional pull, the familiar script beginning again. But now we have the power to respond differently. The repetition ceases not because the world has changed, but because we have. The lesson has been integrated, and the psyche no longer needs to dramatize it externally. What once appeared as fate transforms into freedom. In this light, repetition is not cruelty but compassion. It is the unconscious insisting that we awaken to ourselves, that we stop living reactively and begin to live consciously. Each recurring relationship, however painful, carries within it the possibility of transformation. The moment we understand that these repetitions are messages from the soul rather than punishments from life, we step out of the cycle. The pattern dissolves, and we find ourselves standing at the threshold of a new kind of relationship. One not dictated by old wounds, but guided by awareness. In breaking the repetition, we fulfill the unconscious demand for consciousness, and in doing so, we become whole. Many people who continually attract toxic relationships pride themselves on being compassionate, kind, and understanding. They are the ones who forgive easily, who see the best in others, who believe that love can heal anyone. Yet behind this apparent virtue often lies an unconscious fear, a fear of rejection, abandonment, or disapproval. Jung would say that the light of compassion conceals a shadow, and until that shadow is made conscious, the same pattern will repeat. What appears to be selflessness may in truth be self-neglect. The inability to set boundaries is not evidence of moral superiority, but of psychological imbalance, for it reveals a conflict between the ego's desire for harmony and the soul's demand for authenticity. Compassion without boundaries is not compassion at all. It is a hidden plea for acceptance. Many individuals equate love with sacrifice because somewhere in their early experience, love was conditional. They learned that to be loved, they must please, fix, or endure. This early conditioning becomes a blueprint for adult relationships. The psyche, ever loyal to its original pattern, continues to attract those who mirror the unresolved dynamic. The toxic person, self-centered, the manipulative or emotionally unavailable, becomes the perfect match for the one who cannot say no. Together they enact a psychological drama that serves the unconscious need for recognition. The giver and the taker, the healer and the wounded, the savior and the victim, all are opposite poles of the same inner conflict. When one cannot assert boundaries, it is usually because the shadow side of compassion remains unacknowledged. The shadow contains anger, resentment, and the natural impulse for self-protection, qualities often suppressed in those who idealize kindness. To maintain an image of goodness, they repress their aggressive instincts, imagining that to assert themselves is to become selfish or unloving. But repression does not eliminate these instincts, it drives them underground. They return in disguised form, attracting relationships that force confrontation with the very energy that has been denied. The toxic person becomes the outer representation of the inner aggression that the individual cannot own. Life provides, through conflict, the opportunity to reclaim this dissound strength. Boundaries are not barriers, they are expressions of self-respect. To set one is to say, I recognize my own worth and the limits of my energy. Yet for many, this assertion feels dangerous. The unconscious fear is that if one stops giving, one will stop being loved. This fear keeps the pattern alive. Each time the individual tolerates mistreatment, they unconsciously confirm the belief that love must be earned. The psyche reenacts the old wound until consciousness intervenes. To become aware of this dynamic is to begin breaking the spell of codependency, a psychological enchantment where one's value depends on being needed. From a Jungian view, the healing lies in integrating the opposites: love and power, gentleness and strength. When compassion is married to firmness, it becomes a conscious virtue rather than a compulsion. This integration requires acknowledging the shadow emotions that accompany giving: the anger at being taken for granted, the exhaustion of always being the caretaker, the silent resentment that builds when one's needs are ignored. By admitting these feelings, we withdraw their destructive power. They no longer need to manifest through toxic relationships because they have been brought into awareness. The outer aggressor fades when the inner assertiveness is reclaimed. The work of individuation demands that we become whole, not merely good. The wholeness includes the capacity to say no, to withdraw, to protect oneself when necessary. The soul does not seek martyrdom, it seeks balance. Every time we rescue someone at the cost of ourselves, we betray that inner balance. The unconscious responds by arranging situations that expose the imbalance more dramatically, hoping we will finally see. The people who exploit our kindness are unwitting teachers, revealing where we have confused compassion with self-abandonment. When boundaries are restored, relationships begin to change. Those who thrived on our compliance drift away, and new connections arise, ones based on mutual respect rather than dependency. Compassion becomes a conscious choice, not a survival strategy. We learn that saying no does not make us unloving, it makes our love honest. The paradox is that true empathy emerges only when we have faced our own fear of rejection. Once we no longer seek validation through others, our giving becomes genuine, free from hidden motives. We can love without losing ourselves, forgive without excusing harm, and help without enabling destruction. To heal from the compulsion to attract toxic people, one must face the fear that lies beneath the mask of compassion. It is the fear of being alone, of being unloved, of confronting one's own worth independent of others' approval. When this fear is met consciously, the need to please dissolves. What remains is authentic care, rooted in strength rather than insecurity. The heart can then open fully, not as a sacrifice, but as a choice grounded in self-awareness. Only by integrating the shadow of compassion can one love in a way that liberates both oneself and others from the cycle of toxicity. Every encounter with a toxic person, though painful, carries within it a deeper psychological invitation. Jung called this invitation the call to individuation, the process through which a person becomes whole by integrating the unconscious parts of the self. Life, in its mysterious wisdom, uses relationships as instruments for this development. The people we attract are not random. They are messengers of our inner landscape. Those who wound us reveal the unhealed aspects of our being. In this sense, the toxicity is not only an external condition, but also an inner reflection, calling us to confront what remains unacknowledged in our own psyche. Each difficult relationship is a summons to growth, an opportunity to move closer to psychological wholeness. The path of individuation is not one of comfort, but of confrontation. The ego desires stability and harmony, but the soul seeks transformation. When we repeatedly attract harmful or draining individuals, the psyche is attempting to awaken us from unconscious patterns. It draws to us people who embody our rejected traits or unresolved wounds, forcing us to recognize them. The narcissist may reflect our hidden arrogance or our denial of self-worth. The manipulative partner may embody the parts of us that manipulate subtly through guilt or fear. If these reflections are not punishments, but mirrors showing where the ego's image of itself conflicts with the deeper truth of who we are. In Jungian psychology, individuation is the process by which we become aware of the self, the totality that includes both light and shadow. Every toxic relationship functions as a catalyst for this awareness. When we are hurt or betrayed, something in us breaks open, and through that crack, light enters. Pain strips away illusions, exposing the parts of our personality that have been built on denial or dependency. The pattern of attracting toxic people often persists until we finally accept the lesson they bring, that our worth, power, and peace do not depend on anyone else. Until that realization emerges, the psyche will continue to bring forward relationships that highlight our unfinished work. Each time we meet a toxic person and respond unconsciously, by blaming, rescuing, or enduring, we reinforce the old pattern. But when we respond with reflection instead of reaction, something changes. The outer conflict becomes an inner dialogue. We begin to ask, what is this situation trying to reveal about me? What part of myself have I ignored or denied? This inquiry marks the turning point of individuation. Instead of trying to escape pain, we use it as a means of self-discovery. The toxic person ceases to be merely an antagonist and becomes a symbolic figure in our inner drama. Through them, we learn about our boundaries, desires, fears, and the parts of the soul that long for expression. The process of individuation demands courage, for it requires us to face the shadow without judgment. The qualities we project onto others, selfishness, cruelty, deceit, also live within us in latent form. To accept this is to reclaim our power. We no longer see ourselves as victims of toxic people, but as participants in a greater process of integration. The psyche uses relationship as its classroom and pain as its teacher. Each conflict, betrayal, or disappointment becomes material for consciousness. What we integrate no longer controls us. What we make conscious loses its ability to wound. The individuation does not mean isolating oneself from others or transcending human vulnerability. It means relating from a position of wholeness rather than need. When we integrate our shadow, we stop seeking completion through others. We no longer need the toxic person to play the role of our teacher, because we have internalized the lesson. Compassion replaces resentment, not because we condone harmful behavior, but because we understand the psychological necessity that brought it into being. The awareness that arises from individuation transforms suffering into meaning. What once seemed like misfortune now appears as a necessary step toward the realization of the self. As this inner work unfolds, relationships begin to shift. Those built on projection or unconscious need dissolve, while those rooted in authenticity emerge. The individual becomes less reactive, more discerning, and inwardly free. The same patterns that once repeated endlessly lose their charge. One no longer feels compelled to save, fix, or endure, because the inner fragments that attracted those dynamics have been healed. The toxic person, in retrospect, is seen not as a curse, but as a symbol of the psyche's relentless drive toward consciousness. They were the shadow's emissary, sent to awaken the sleeping parts of the soul. The call to individuation is the call to take responsibility for one's inner life. It is the recognition that every outer conflict mirrors an inner division. By accepting this truth, we end the cycle of projection and reclaim our wholeness. Individuation transforms suffering into wisdom and chaos into order. To answer this call is to step into one's full humanity, to hold both light and darkness without fear, and to meet the world not as a wounded child seeking validation, but as a conscious being who has made peace with the depths of their own soul. Transformation begins not through escape from pain, but through awareness of it. In Jungian psychology, the awareness is the bridge between the conscious and the unconscious, between who we think we are and who we truly are. The toxic relationships often serve as the crucible for this transformation. They awaken powerful emotions, anger, fear, shame, helplessness, that force us to confront the hidden forces shaping our behavior. Without awareness, we remain trapped in projection and repetition, blaming others for the very patterns our own psyche perpetuates. With awareness, however, we step into the position of the observer, and in doing so, we begin to reclaim our power. The first movement of transformation is recognition. We start to notice that the same types of people or situations keep reappearing, carrying the same emotional flavor. At first, it may feel like fate or bad luck, but deeper reflection reveals the psychological pattern beneath. The psyche repeats experiences until consciousness grows. Each encounter with toxicity is an invitation to see something we have not yet understood about ourselves. The manipulative partner, the critical friend, the draining colleague, all serve as mirrors for our unhealed parts. When we see this clearly, judgment gives way to curiosity, and pain becomes a teacher rather than a sentence. Awareness is not simply intellectual understanding, it is a shift in perception that changes how we experience reality. Jung called it making the unconscious conscious. The toxic person loses their power over us the moment we see the psychological role they play. They no longer represent a mysterious external threat, but a reflection of an inner truth. The anger we feel toward them may reveal our own unexpressed aggression. The sadness they evoke may uncover our buried need for approval. In seeing these dynamics, we withdraw the projection. What once seemed like someone else's fault becomes material for our growth. Awareness transforms blame into insight. This process demands honesty and self-compassion. Many resist awareness because it dismantles cherished illusions. It exposes how we have contributed to our own suffering, how our silence, the fear or desire for love made us complicit in the toxicity we endured. Yet this recognition is liberating, for it shows that the power to change lies within. When we stop waiting for others to behave differently and begin examining our own responses, we take responsibility for our inner life. Responsibility, in Jung's sense, is not guilt but ownership, the willingness to hold our experiences as expressions of the soul's unfolding journey. As awareness deepens, the emotional charge around toxic relationships begins to dissolve. We no longer feel drawn to the same destructive patterns, because the unconscious need that sustained them has been integrated. The psyche, once split between light and shadow, starts to harmonize. Where there was projection, there is now understanding. Where there was reaction, there is choice. This is the essence of transformation, to act from consciousness rather than compulsion. We begin to sense the quiet authority of the self, the inner center that observes without judgment and guides without force. Transformation through awareness also changes the nature of love. Before awareness, love often carries the burden of expectation. It seeks completion through another person. After awareness, love becomes freer, less possessive, more rooted in authenticity. We see others not as saviors or enemies, but as fellow travelers on the path of individuation. The toxic person who once caused pain is recognized as part of the psyche's alchemical process, the necessary agent that turned unconscious lead into conscious gold. Through this realization, forgiveness arises naturally, not as moral duty, but as understanding. We forgive not to excuse behavior, but to release ourselves from its grip. Awareness also reshapes boundaries. We no longer confuse kindness with compliance or empathy with endurance. Because we see our own worth clearly, we do not need to prove it through sacrifice. We can say no without guilt, walk away without fear, and care without losing ourselves. This balance of compassion and discernment marks the maturity of the awakened soul. The lessons learned through toxicity become inner wisdom that guides future relationships. The people we attract begin to mirror our new state of consciousness, those who respect, uplift, and match our integrity. In Jungian terms, this is the movement from shadow to self. Awareness integrates what was divided, heals what was wounded, and transforms what was unconscious into light. The outer world changes because the inner world has changed. Life no longer feels like a battlefield of toxic encounters, but like a dialogue between the conscious ego and the guiding intelligence of the psyche. We see that every experience, no matter how painful, served a purpose in awakening us to ourselves. Through awareness, the cycle ends, and what once was poison becomes medicine. The soul, having recognized its reflection in every mirror, now stands whole, radiant, and free.